Good evening, everyone. And if you don't mind, I'll just take my mask off for a second here. Before we begin tonight's meeting, I just wanted to say a couple words about what we witnessed yesterday in our nation's capital. And I will note that these comments are my own. They are not necessarily reflective of the entire board, the administrative staff, or our district, but I nonetheless feel that given what has happened, a few comments might be in order. There are those who might say that it is not the position of a school board or a district to weigh in on these events, but I don't believe that that is correct, because our job as a governing board in a school district is first and foremost to educate our students so that they are productive members of our society, but also good citizens. And secondly, given what happened, we do know that there are individuals in our community who play a role in what happened last night, and it's important to address these topics. Our teachers and our staff are professionals. One of the main things that they do, and that I did as a student, was discuss current events in our classrooms. It's a way of ensuring that students are engaged with the world around them. It's a great way for students to work on their oratory and discussion skills. It's a great way for them to weigh in and consider what they're learning in class and how does that match up with the reality of the world around us. The United States and the state of Arizona and the people of this nation have a lot to be proud of. We are a great nation, and we've had amazing achievements and successes over our 200-plus year history. But we also have dark spots and issues that even today, even if they are over 100 years old, we still need to deal with. I have to say that witnessing the waving of Confederate flags or neo-Nazi flags in the nation's capital is extremely disturbing. Storming our nation's capital is extremely disturbing. I grew up in a time where images of people clashing in a Congress building was more fitting of a failed nation state than of a democracy like our own. And I'm also very well aware of the fact that we are still a nation dealing with racial disparities. Confederate flag is first and foremost a symbol of slavery. That is why the South seceded. The neo-Nazi flag is a flag of fascism. It's a flag that sought to exterminate 12 million plus Jews, but also people with special needs, Romanies, political dissidents, and so many more. As a 26-year-old, since my age is often used, both in my favor and against me, I have to say that this is not the type of nation or political system that I would want to raise my children in. It's not the type of nation or system that I would want to have kids in. But I know that as teachers, and in fact today in visiting one of our elementary schools, teachers were doing these lessons with their kids about current events and about what happened yesterday. There's a lot that can be discussed. It is a shame that our leadership has acted the way it has in inciting this. It really is. It's not fitting. This election, like any election, is a tough one. We all fight for our side. We all want certain people to win. And there were many people I voted for in this election that lost. And that's the shame of it. But we're better together because we are a nation of ideas. And I think Senator Webster said it best in 1830, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. We are always better together. And I hope that we can use this time to reflect with our students and with our children and with each other, our friends and family, to really discuss what we want to see and how we want to see this nation move forward so that we can put shameful events like what occurred yesterday behind us. Thank you.
Thank you.
The January 7th, 2021 special meeting and executive session of the Scottsdale Unified Number 8 Governing Board will come to order at 5:05 p.m. All rise. Vice President Sanowski will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The chair will now have a roll call, starting from the chair's right.
Zach Lindsay.
Libby Hart Wells.
Julie Sanowski.
Patty.
Patty Beckman.
Jan Michael Greenberg. All governing board members are present, with board member Beckman appearing via video conferencing, and there is a quorum. The board now moves to agenda item 4, approval of agenda. Is there a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
So moved.
Board member Hart Wells moves. Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Board member Lindsay seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve the agenda as presented. Is there any debate? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those
Aye.
opposed say no. The motion is adopted 5-0. The board will now move to agenda item 5, executive session. The chair moves to recess into executive session pursuant to Arizona Revised Statute Section 38-43103A3 to receive legal advice from the attorney for the public body regarding the following topics: review of the legal opinion on mandating COVID testing for all staff and students, discussion regarding mandating COVID vaccinations for staff, and discussion of extended FFCRA benefits. Is there a second to the motion? Board member Hart Wells seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board recess into executive session pursuant to Arizona Revised Statute Section 38-43103A3 to receive legal advice from the attorney for the public body regarding the 3 topics identified in the agenda. Is there any debate? No? All those in favor say aye.
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 All opposed say no. The motion is adopted 5-0. The board will now convene in executive session. The board is reconvening in its executive session at 6:20 PM. The chair moves to adjourn the board's executive session. Is there a second to the motion? Vice President Sinowski seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board adjourn the executive session. Is there any debate? All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no. The motion carries 5-0. The executive session is adjourned at 6:21 PM. The special meeting is reconvened at 6:21 PM. The board will move to action item 6A, recommend approval of up to 64 hours of paid sick leave as a benefit of employment regarding one of the 6 qualifying reasons for leave related to COVID-19 under the previous Families First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA, for the time period of January 1st, 2021 to March 31st, 2021, subject to the conditions outlined. Is there any debate?
Discussion?
Or discussion, debate or discussion? Vice President Sinowski?
Can we clarify what the 6 qualifying reasons would be?
We can. The 6 qualifying reasons for which any one is a valid reason are as follows. 1, employee is required by the government to quarantine or isolate due to COVID-19, and they must provide a copy of the order. Number 2, employee has been advised by their healthcare provider to quarantine or self-isolate due to COVID-19, and they must provide written documentation by a healthcare provider advising you to self-quarantine due to concerns related to COVID-19. Number 3, employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and seeking medical prognosis. They must provide the healthcare provider statement and their first day of absence and the first day of symptoms. Number 4, employee is caring for a child if the school or place of care has been closed or the child care provider is unavailable for reasons related to COVID-19, and they must provide the name of the child and school name or child care provider name and statement indicating no other suitable person is available to care for the child during the requested leave. Number 5, employee is caring for any individual who is subject to a government order to quarantine or has been advised to self-quarantine, and they must provide a copy of the order. And number 6, employee is experiencing any other substantially similar conditions specified by the Department of Health and Human Services. Those are the 6 reasons, and any one is a valid reason for this leave. Board Member Hart Wells.
Just for the community, perhaps you could just give some context of the origin of this particular, and the reference, the legislation that's now expired, is why we're considering this particular.
Yes, and I may ask our legal counsel to help us, but the basis for this recommendation is that the FFCRA did provide leave for certain reasons related to COVID-19 if an employee contracted COVID-19 or had to leave for any of the reasons of the 6 reasons identified above. That legislation expired at the end of 2020 and has not been extended, but employers may voluntarily provide this should they so choose. And in the case of Scottsdale Unified School District, the reasons why we would perhaps wish to provide this extended leave are numerous. Of course, first and foremost, it is a mitigation strategy in helping to contain COVID-19. We do not want individuals who are sick, specifically staff members, of course, coming onto campus and then potentially infecting other staff members or students. We want to, of course, provide a supportive network for our staff and maintain our staffing levels. Staffing levels are a problem in our district and districts across Arizona, but specific to SUSD, we have had to close schools due to decreased staffing levels, and it is always a concern of ours. We wanted to reduce the likelihood of economic pressure on staff members feeling that they needed to come into work in order to provide for their families when in fact they were ill and would be best served by staying at home. And I'm not sure if there are any other reasons that board members might have to support the extension of this leave.
I'll just add to the last provision. One benefit to the organization, of course, is that we've already had trouble with our substitute fill rates, and that if personnel felt like they needed to show up ill because of that pressure, 1, for income, but 2, also just as a commitment to their students, we wouldn't want to create that type of dynamic. And so the organization benefits from this particular provision as well, in terms of organizational health and safety.
Vice President Sanowski?
To clarify, so an employee would go through the HR department to utilize this?
Yes, I believe this form is made available by HR. Is that correct, Dr. Baumann?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Board Member Lindsay?
I would just like to add that, we have heard from very concerned staff that were worried about this expiring, and I just want to thank Dr. Menzel and the cabinet for being creative and offering a possible solution for this. Really puts our staff to ease and makes them feel like they're valued.
Thank you, and I would agree with that. Board Member Beckman, do you have any comments or questions?
No, I think everyone said it all. Thank you for bringing it forward in a timely fashion so that our employees can feel some relief.
Okay, if there's no further discussion, the chair moves to approve up to 64 hours of paid sick leave as a benefit of employment regarding one of the 6 qualifying reasons for leave related to COVID-19 under the previous Families First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA, for the time period of January 1st, 2021 to March 31st, 2021, subject to the conditions outlined. Is there a second to the motion? Vice President Sanowski seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board approve up to 64 hours of the paid sick leave time pursuant to the old reasons stated under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA, for the time period of January 1st, 2021 to March 31st, 2021, subject to the conditions outlined. Is there any further debate? All those in favor say aye.
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 The motion carries 5-0. The board will now move to action item 6B, review of phased-in return to learning in person and potential modifications of the plan, including potential changes to any learning format, for example, hybrid, in-person teacher-led instruction, virtual, and so forth. Dr. Menzel?
Thank you, President Greenberg, Vice President Sanowski, and members of the governing board. Appreciate the opportunity to provide just a little bit of a review in terms of where we are, what's been approved, and new information from conversations that happened today. As you know, we regularly get new information that is relevant for consideration by the governing board. But to start with, on December 15th, the governing board met and considered second semester phased-in return to learn. At that meeting, I shared with the governing board a statement by the Maricopa County Department of Public Health with respect to the conditions we were facing at the time. As you know, the metrics were moving to all red. They weren't quite there yet, but they were moving in that direction. And the health department has issued a statement that indicated when all 3 benchmark metrics are red, their recommendation is to return to virtual. They qualified that recommendation by indicating the statement is a general recommendation in discussions with Arizona Department of Health Services, Maricopa Department of Public Health, in discussion with ADHS, MCDPH and ADHS have agreed to support those jurisdictions who are able to maintain a safe learning environment with regular school-by-school monitoring, regardless of levels of community COVID-19 transmission. If a school district does not have enough staffing to maintain a safe environment, or if a school district experiences a school-related outbreak that cannot be controlled with public health mitigation strategies, MCDPH would support transitioning to a virtual learning environment. Further, with the recent publications emphasizing the benefits of in-person learning, particularly for elementary schools, and the emerging data indicating that in-person school attendance is not a risk factor for youth testing positive for COVID-19, MCDPH recommends preferentially keeping elementary and middle schools open for in-person learning. If a phased approach is desired, MCDPH recommends beginning with elementary and middle schools prior to opening high schools to in-person learning. I read that tonight because that was the guidance that informed the decision that was made by the prior governing board to adopt a phase-in strategy where on January 4th, our elementary schools returned to in-person learning, along with special education self-contained and preschool. The plan, as it was approved at that time, indicated that middle school would return on January 11th to in-person learning and that high school would resume on January 19th. That was predicated on the guidance provided by the health department. The motion approved by the board also signaled that the superintendent should consult with Maricopa County Department of Public Health in between or during the break before school started on January 4th to determine whether or not any of the conditions within our community warranted a modification or change to the guidance that was issued at that time. In my conversation with Dr. Sonnenschein in December, at the end of December, she indicated that given what they were seeing in the data, there was not a recommendation to modify the phased-in return, with the note that she would recommend monitoring the return for middle school and high school based on community conditions and based on what we learned in the initial implementation of bringing back elementary students. So earlier today, I had an opportunity to talk with Dr. Sonnenschein, who, as I'm sure you can imagine, has been really busy with the vaccination rollout, particularly the fact that with 1B priority for school employees starting on Monday, there's been a lot of community education and logistics associated with that. But I appreciate her time and her reflection. And so I asked her specifically about, given the data that we've received today, because our 3 benchmark metrics remain all red, as they have been for the last few weeks, is there any modification or change in terms of the recommendation? And her first question was, what are we seeing with respect to COVID in the elementary schools that are open? And so what I reported to her was that in 7 of our buildings, there are no cases. In 4 of our buildings, there is 1 case. In 2 buildings, there are 2 cases. And in 3 buildings, there are 3 cases. So from an overall perspective, if you think about the COVID dashboard reporting that we've done over time, those are really low numbers. And it's in some respects not surprising. We're just coming off the 2-week break, but it was encouraging because it reflects what we've seen before, and that is we've had low numbers in our elementary schools. We have low numbers after the end of this first week. And so her comment with respect to middle school was that it would seem reasonable to proceed. So I pushed a little bit because I know that there's some concern within the community, and particularly with our staff, related to photos that have surfaced for students that may have enjoyed New Year's Eve and partied. And so is there any value or benefit, was my question to her, related to maybe extending the middle school time of online learning for another week? And she said it wouldn't be required from where we sit, but it also wouldn't be problematic if it provided an extra degree of assurance or confidence for the community. But the overall guidance remains the same, to be able to do the school-by-school evaluation of whether or not there's a spread, and if we can manage that over time, then we can meet the learning needs of our students. When it comes to high school, that's been an issue of concern for her in multiple conversations that I've had, in terms of it's one that we need to watch a little bit more closely. And so I ask another question because I know that some of our other districts in the valley have created some thresholds of percent positive in a building that would return a building to virtual learning for a period of time. And so I asked her a question about that and whether or not it was something that the health department recommended, advised, how she felt about it. And she said a couple of things that I thought were really important. One, that setting that threshold is arbitrary, right? There's no science that says what percent you would use. But she said it could be a reasonable thing to provide some clarity for staff and families with respect to what a district's threshold would be for returning a building to virtual learning for a period of time. And part of if you look at Chandler in particular, one of the things that is included in the way that they've structured it is you get a 48-hour notice to parents, a 5-day period of return to virtual, and then you come back to in-person. So you've bounded the conversation. One of the things that I've heard from a lot of people is that uncertainty. We don't know what the metric would be or the threshold for going back to virtual. We also don't know what it would be to return to in-person if we went back to virtual. And so that was my question. And so while there's some flexibility with respect to how those numbers would be established, she said it would be reasonable, but that would be a district-level decision. We could do it in consultation with the health department, but it's not one where you would be able to say the science says this is the measure. It would be truly a locally generated position. So with that information, the other piece that we talked about was the vaccination rollout and schedule. Because we know that beginning on Monday, 1B individuals are eligible for the vaccination. And as you know, we've been working with Honor Health to create those 3 days for our employees to be able to get vaccinated on January 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. As of this afternoon, we've had more than 1,000 employees sign up to be included in that vaccination drive. I asked Dr. Sonnenschein, what about people who might want to go online and sign up to get earlier consideration? And the truth is, by having the partnership with Honor Health, we're probably having our staff in a position that they're more likely to get vaccinated earlier rather than later, because in the first couple of weeks, they're trying to fill open slots, but they're still closing out the second shot for 1A. And so the number of available vaccination slots is probably not as great. So we are really grateful, and I want to just mention this to the board, for the partnership with Honor Health so that we could make this opportunity available for our staff. And with that, we are now at a point where, from an administrative perspective, there's a plan that was adopted by the prior governing board for our phased-in return. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have and see what the will of the governing board is as we move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Menzel. Before we move to discussion, because with any motion there is always time for debate, I wanted to ask if there is any motion that somebody would like to make now to debate that specifically, or whether discussion is just preferred. Does anyone have a motion they would like to make at this time? Okay, then I will open the floor to discussion. Do any board members have any comments or questions? Vice President Sanowski.
Dr. Menzel, you had mentioned that the cases at the elementary level, are those new cases or cases reported since return back to school?
Those are cases reported since back to school, so they're reported in the time that they've come back to school this week.
Okay, and we had the elementary forum on Monday.
Correct.
What have you found since Monday that would support the continuation of in-person learning at the elementary level?
So we are continuing to work with our staff to identify what mitigation strategies are in place or that they would like to have in order to feel safe in the learning environment. One request, for example, was we needed more hand washing stations, and we had facilities out to identify how we can get that put in place. For those that may want plexiglass and have made requests, if that hasn't happened, it appears as though there might be an issue with how the request was made, and so we're working to identify all of those needs, working with our building partners to be able to address those concerns as well. The challenge always in this environment is we have high levels of COVID spread in the community. One of the things I learned today is that we have 60 staff members who have tested positive, and that was not because they were in school, it was during the break. It's just one of those things where we recognize that the environment is such that while they were not in school, they were exposed and were infected with COVID. And that's not a judgmental statement. That's just an acknowledgement that that's even people who are being cautious sometimes find themselves in a position where they've been exposed. From a public health perspective, and this is why those conversations with Dr. Sonnenschein have been so important, if we're able to create an environment where we're not transmitting COVID within the building, particularly for our youngest learners, and we can maintain that situation, that's a benefit all the way around. And so we are deeply committed to the mitigation strategies. The other part, and I don't have all the data right now, but I'm trying to identify whether or not there are any trends related to parents sending sick kids to school, because that's always our other risk. This has got to be a partnership between the parents, the community, and the school if we want to continue to be able to offer in-person instruction. I don't know that there are any trends there yet, but it's one of the data points that's important to me to look at. If we have parents who are knowingly sending sick kids to school, that if it's a pattern, becomes a concern.
Board Member Hart Wells.
I actually have a statement I'd like to read, and I'll just acknowledge that it's not as polished as I'd like. I was derailed after yesterday's events. Did not get to polish this up quite as much as I'd like. But I'd also like to just comment and thank Honor Health. I think that partnership and you forging that partnership so quickly, Dr. Menzel, is a very positive, constructive step, and thank you as a parent, community member, and teacher myself. So here I go. There is a quiz at the end. This is fairly technical. No, teasing. It is technical, but there's no quiz. All right. This is because, like everyone on the board, we have received numerous communications from the community welcomed. And I thought it was appropriate, after having read all of them, you might not have heard back from me, but I read all of them, and some of them multiple times, that it might be worth walking through some of the technical components of our situation to clarify. So, to my fellow members of our community, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts, your concerns, your understandable frustrations, your opinions and suggestions. Please know that it was with an open mind and an open heart that I have read every one of your communications, at least those that I've received as of 2 o'clock today, and some multiple times. I want to express my sincere gratitude to those of you that shared personal testimonies and experiences, and importantly, constructive suggestions, not at the expense of another's views. I, like you, prefer civility. So to the matter at hand, I want to set the table with a little bit of technical context. SARS-CoV-2 is a virus. You know that. But that's actually an acronym. That's the name of the actual virus that causes COVID-19, which is a clinical diagnosis. The acronym SARS-CoV-2 stands for Severe Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. So, of course, we shorten that into an acronym. That's a mouthful. It belongs to the coronavirus genus, specifically beta coronaviruses, which is within the family Coronaviridae and the subfamily Coronavirinae. The beta coronavirus genus, it contains a few notorious species that have, in recent years, caused considerable harm to the animal kingdom, and that harm we typically view as impact on ourselves. So you're likely familiar with the clinical diagnosis, severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, and now COVID-19, which stands for Coronavirus Disease 2019. The virus that causes COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, is novel in that it is new to our body of knowledge, not necessarily that it is new to the natural world. In other words, novel is a relative term. And just keeping with this thread of relativity, I want to take a minute to highlight 2 observations among these coronaviruses that I've listed. SARS and MERS outbreaks were caused by these related viruses that each resulted in serious public health impacts on humankind. Also, they are respiratory illnesses as well. They enter the body through mucosal tissues. Mucosal tissues are at every orifice of your body, which is why your mask should cover your nose and not a chin strap. The symptoms you feel with upper respiratory infections are very common symptoms that you also experience with SARS and MERS, and what we thought with COVID-19. And those outbreaks happen to be successfully reined in using the same public health mitigation strategies that are being asked of us today. So what's different with COVID-19? Why aren't those same strategies as effective for this COVID-19 as they were for SARS and MERS? So I'm going to answer that question. Hopefully you said something nice at home, and if you didn't, you have to say 10 nice things in the next 24 hours. Okay. One relative novelty, so two points here. One relative novelty of COVID-19 as compared to the other beta coronaviruses that's very important for us to keep in mind is pre-symptomatic transmission. The viruses that cause SARS and MERS do not appear to share that feature to a significant degree. Shedding infectious virus, which is technically referred to as a virion, before a host even knows that he or she is sick. This happens in COVID-19. The second relative novelty is that next step of pre-symptomatic transmission and is particularly cruel, and that's asymptomatic transmission. A host whose immune system and body physiology, for reasons we do not understand, is able to manage the infectious disease and so unwittingly infects another. Asymptomatic transmission was not documented as playing a significant role in the SARS and MERS outbreaks. Now, these features raise excellent questions, and many of which they will not be answered by one study, by one media article, by one dashboard. Science is the fundamental understanding of the natural world, and it is not done by press release. Because new credible knowledge is not linear, is not binary, and it is not overnight. It is a process. To date, what we have learned on the graves of too many, globally, nationally, and locally, is that SARS-CoV-2 is not novel in a very important way, and that is its interdependence upon a host to survive and propagate. So to cut to the chase here, we play a critical component to COVID-19 staying or going. This isn't a judgment, but a fact in knowledge that we are keeping this virus alive in our community. The silver lining is that we can collectively, not individually, decide to end this thing. And I think that we all agree, based on the communications I've received, that we're ready for this to be over. The societal disruption of COVID-19 has been tremendous. The community disruption has been tremendous. And let's be honest with ourselves. We're here tonight because of the community disruption, not because of the disease per se. And unfortunately, that disruption has gone on long enough that the cause and effect are no longer mutually exclusive of one another. Just like the community and the schools are not mutually exclusive from one another. The CDC guidance for dynamic decision-making by schools expressly states, and I'm going to read this language, it's been on their website for some time. Success in preventing the introduction and subsequent transmission of SARS-CoV-2 in schools is connected to and dependent upon preventing transmission in communities. Your passionate emails and communications that we have all received demonstrate that you know that and you feel that too. Those same passionate communications demonstrate to me that there is common ground. We are agreed that school is essential to our children's well-being. We are agreed that teachers are essential to our children's well-being. That is no surprise, because you cannot have one without the other. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health enlisted the help and advice of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in partnership with the National Academy of Medicine to develop a framework for the vaccine allocation to assist domestic and global health communities. Very recently, that resulting framework was predicated on foundational principles, both ethical and procedural. I'm going to close this statement by giving you what those foundation principles were for two reasons. Because I believe they are applicable to us as an educational community to frame our discussion and our dynamic decision-making, and they are, in the interest of transparency, the principles that I am using to make my decisions. And that is the first category, ethical principles. Maximum benefit. Second, equal concern. Third, mitigation of health inequities. And in the procedural principles, fairness, transparency, and evidence-based. And I'm going to end my comments there. I am going to use that rubric for my own decision-making. So regardless of what we do tonight, I want you to understand where my mind was and is and will continue to be when I serve on this board. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Hart Wells. Are there any other comments, questions? Vice President Sinowski?
I'd like to thank Dr. Hart Wells for her great lesson this evening. I'm glad it's recorded because it would be something that would be beneficial to go back and watch on a regular basis. So thank you, co-board member. I have some questions about what we're looking at moving forward. And I don't know what the appropriate protocol would be to discuss our current options as an education institution, what we're looking at, what we know, current information, even as of today. Dr. Menzel, you would discuss that, and I had tuned into the ABC 15 community forum that they hosted this afternoon with Will Humble and Garrett Archer and Melissa Blasius, and it was very interesting to hear that what we necessarily need to know to make best decisions, we may not know until the future. And so that makes it really hard for us as a board of leadership to make the best decision. And I concur that we need to be setting standards to make the best decisions for now based on what we know and what we understand. And I do appreciate the community and our staff members who, specifically our staff members who continue to work hard from administrative level throughout our workforce in our district to make those best decisions. We are not perfect, and even the decisions that we make, knowing everything we know, because this is new, novel, we may not be making the best decisions, but we do what we can at the appropriate time. So my point of view is let's discuss, if we can, the options that we're faced with. I'd like to know more about the elementary experience this week, and then potentially discuss, future decisions, because I know there has been angst in our community about metrics being set and metrics changing, and claims that we're not living by the metrics and what we're saying we're going to do, that's not guiding our process. So I would like for us to continue to have not just more discussion, but potential action items on setting forth more discussion and action related to those metrics, the reasons why we're going to open or close or stay in the different formats of learning.
Dr. Menzel, do you want to address that first, or would you like me to make a quick comment on that? So I believe, unless our legal counsel feels differently, this is quite a broadly worded action item, and I do not believe that there's any issue with making multiple motions that could be approved separately under this. For example, and I guess we will find out here, but for example, if you wanted to, my understanding is if you wanted to make a motion to close elementary schools and that passed, you could also make another motion within this item to do something else, or is that not permitted?
So, Mr. President, members of the governing board, this is Jennifer McLennan. I'm with Gus Rosenfeld. Ms. Marshall stepped out so I can fill in. The agenda item is broadly written so that the governing board can take what action it sees fit. That was at the direction of Dr. Menzel. He wants to make sure that the will of the board is followed out after this evening. The best course of action in terms of procedure, Mr. Greenberg, would be to make a motion that is all-encompassing with the various levels.
Okay.
So it may be a very long run-on sentence, but or
That's
run-on.
fine. I will type it out.
Right, but that would be the best way to do this. So
Okay.
whatever scenario you are envisioning, put it into a long, drawn-out motion, and that would be the best case scenario. Thank you.
Very well. And for clarity on the record, I will type it out, and we will make sure it is as exact as the board wants before we take any vote. But insofar as the discussion generally, I believe you can ask in relation to our reopen plans and what we would want to do and how we want to modify them. We can have that discussion right now, including metrics, whether you want to install those, questions about our data, anything to that effect is listed on our agenda. It's covered by our agenda. Are there any comments or questions at this time? Vice President Zanowski, yes.
Thank you. Can I include what I would like that I think where we need to go right now? Can we have that discussion right now?
Yes, of course.
Okay. I definitely would like for us to have a very clear understanding of the elementary experience so far this week. I also think it's very necessary for us to discuss, because as of right now, Monday, we have told our community that there's a return to learn for middle school. So I'd like for us to specifically discuss that option, or if there are others that we as a board would like to consider. And then the following week, we are expected to return to learn in person at the high school level. So I would also like for us to discuss that. So not just whether we're going to, but what that looks like specifically to the child that shows up and to the staff member from beginning to end of day.
Okay, well, then let's break this down by topic. So the first topic, let us start with elementary schools and whether the board or any board member would like to propose a motion ultimately on changing our current plans with elementary schools. I will open the floor for questions or discussion. Board Member Hart Wells.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Menzel, this is actually a question for you. If you could summarize your conversation with Dr. Sonnenschein. You had indicated she had asked for what the case positive data was for the last 4 days. Was there any further discussion or broader scoped discussion with respect to 4 weeks of all red metrics from the public health dashboard, knowing and acknowledging that there is, and then some, in the guidelines, and they are guidelines, by the way, they're not prescriptive, But was there anything broader than beyond that specific data set that you discussed with respect to the elementary schools and their current, face-to-face?
So I did have a chance to ask if there would be any other efforts to address the community-wide spread, systemic response. As many of you know, we shared it actually in December 15th as well. Hospital administrators called on the governor to take action with respect to indoor dining, other venues where we know that COVID is spreading more rapidly. And Dr. Sonnenschein indicated as of now, there's no indication that the governor will be taking any action to address those things. I have also asked in the past whether or not closing schools in the absence of all of those other mitigation strategies, would that change the trajectory of community spread? And that's where we've turned to this reliance on a school-by-school review. And she's differentiated between the risk-benefit for elementary and middle school students and high school. So I think that's where we see kind of the differentiation from the public health perspective, that absent other community mitigation strategies, if we just shut down, it's probably not going to impact what we're seeing in terms of community spread. And then you have to ask the question, what's the impact on student learning if you do that? However, there's always been the qualifier with respect to high school to monitor that a little bit differently, because they're older students. Some of the research talks about under the age of 12 and over the age of 12, and so you have the contribution to the spread happening at a different level when you get the older students, and so that's part of the conversation that has transpired. And so I think to answer your question, we don't have hopeful data with respect to action by government officials to do things that would help slow community spread. The hopeful data we have is that the vaccine is here and that we're beginning the process of getting the vaccine out. But we don't have the hope that we're going to get some other coordinated strategies that would make a difference. And so the other advice with respect to what would happen if you close down schools is that you'd still have community spread, not unlike we saw it happen during the holidays. We had 2 full weeks of nobody in school. We didn't see a reduction in transmission of COVID. You saw a continuation and in some cases an uptick. So it's a combination of factors that impact the spread of the virus from the public health conversations I've had.
Board Member Lindsay.
Dr. Menzel, I think it'd be helpful, because we get this question a lot, who is Dr. Sonnenschein? So can you explain to everybody who she is, what her background is, and why her input matters?
Thank you for the question. Dr. Sonnenschein is the medical director for the Maricopa County Department of Public Health, overseeing the Infectious Disease Control Department. She is also a field officer of the CDC and trained epidemiologist. And so she is a point person. You've seen her on the press release with respect to the rollout of the vaccines. And she's got incredible knowledge and experience. She's navigated other pandemics before, none to this scope and scale, right? When we had SARS, it was not this widespread and was actually brought under control relatively quickly in the scheme of a pandemic. This one has been different. But we rely on her advice because what we found is that there are a lot of different people who have a lot of different pieces to Dr. Hart Wells' comments. Science is evolving. It's not a point in time, this is a definitive answer. We continue to build our base of knowledge and understanding. And there's an epidemiological question. There are other questions that come into play. So we'll have pediatricians that weigh in with their perspective on what's acceptable. We'll have other medical specialists weigh in. We'll have PhD researchers weigh in. And all of it has relevance and value. But the question is, how do you take the information that we have and then from a governing board perspective, weigh the educational benefit? So we need to understand from an epidemiological perspective, what's contributing to the spread and what's not. Public health officials, if you've got a norovirus running through a building, they'll close a building. They'll say, you need to close it, do a deep cleaning, and come back in 3 days. They've not done that in this case yet. They're reluctant oftentimes to close schools unless you have something that substantial because of the known benefit of public education. So that's the balancing act. And Dr. Sonnenschein has been the person where I've been able to have the conversation with respect to what are we seeing in the data, how can we ensure that as a district we're moving forward in a way that meets the needs of our kids, doesn't contribute to the spread of the virus, and ensures health, safety, and well-being of our students and staff. And that's why I asked the question about those thresholds that we've seen in other districts, because to me, I think that might be a place where we can answer the question that we heretofore have not answered, where people have thought, well, we're going to follow the benchmark metrics. But remember, those were created back in August when we knew a lot less than we know now. And over time, we moved to this school-by-school analysis. Why would you close a school if you've got no cases in the school and you can provide in-person instruction? Whereas if you have a place where you've got a lot of infections, it makes sense to call a timeout and move to virtual learning. So we had that shift over time, but it never landed somewhere, which is why, to your point, Vice President Sanowski, there's been some concern. Well, we thought you said this, but now you're doing that. And I do believe that we need to have more clarity around that so that both our staff and our families understand what the threshold indicators would be that would warrant returning an entire building to virtual learning for a period of time. I still think and would recommend that we look at it on a school-by-school basis rather than the entire district, because I'm going to advocate for our kids, and when and where possible, in-person education makes a tremendous difference. And so I would not want to just say to the 22,000 students in Scottsdale, if one place has a hot spot, no one can come to school. I would advise against that. So I do think there's an opportunity here to do some work that would allow us to be able to put some parameters on it that would be helpful for all of our stakeholders.
Board Member Hart Wells.
I just want to bore down a little bit more for the community's benefit than discussion purposes, but obviously for discussion purposes. But this word data is a loaded word. And as of, 3-4 months ago, a report came out in cautioning, cautioning decision-making kind of wholeheartedly on a number, particularly in a dynamic situation like we find ourselves. That's why the CDC guidance for schools says dynamic decision-making, because we have to continue to adapt to the realities and as new information comes to light and knit that together. One study is not compelling and is not a comprehensive picture. So with respect to that term data, follow the data. Let's talk about what that word means a little bit. There are 7 different types of data right now that are being used and continuing to increase. That data set is continuing to increase to make decisions to manage COVID-19 at all levels of government around the world. And every one of those types of data sets has warts and limitations. So it is not an accurate statement to say the data says it's this. That is not correct. It is not a comprehensive perspective on the body of knowledge that's been generated. And I pointed out in my remarks that this surveillance data that the county is posting on its dashboard, I look at that with a heavy heart, because those data points are lives. There are faces on those data points. They're not just numbers. So I think we need to keep this in perspective. The limitations of the data sets don't all fit together nicely like puzzle pieces, like we would like to. In maybe 10 years, that will be the case. But it isn't the case today. So, and I superimpose that caution on the data we have in front of us with our building numbers as well. And the dashboards, it all has limitations. So you'd have to be careful at your analysis that you don't construe or don't apply motivated reasoning, which is a concept that you already know what you want the conclusion to be, and you reverse engineer and back into numbers. So we need to be very careful to not do that, regardless of what the objective analysis leads us to. And if I can, since I have the stage, my rubric that I referred to, the founding principles that were used to establish the framework for vaccine allocation, could be more specifically delineated, and I have done that, into more of a kind of analysis in terms of susceptibility to our different groups of stakeholders in the community, and that is by age, because there does seem to be some suggestions, not proofs, suggestions that younger persons physiologically may not have the same kinds of susceptibility. The mechanism of action of the virus seems to exploit certain things in our bodies that maybe our youngest among us don't have yet. That is not uncommon. Severe morbidity and mortality. That's where this disease is hard, right? Negative societal impact. And it depends on how you construe that term, negative societal impact of the disease or of closing schools. It depends on how you want to look at that, right? But you have to articulate that to yourself before you start assigning, right, analysis. And then transmissibility. And that was actually the category that's the hardest because of the reasons I named: pre-symptomatic transmission and asymptomatic transmission. You cannot fault someone for not going to get a test if they don't know they're sick, because they're not sick, because they're not exhibiting symptoms. And that is happening with this disease. So it really is a moving target. So again, I just caution folks to use your objective thinking, your empathy, grace, and an ability to be a problem solver and adapt to those challenges, because that's what we want our kids to learn when we send them to school, and we need to emulate that behavior now. So that statement that the data says this, that just can't possibly, in the fact pattern that we are living in right now, be an accurate statement. If it was contextual, yes, it could be. So I guess that was why I asked you if there was a broader context for this conversation with Dr. Sonnenschein outside of that one very specific data set, which isn't, it's very hard. You can't make a decision on one data set, right? Not a broad strokes decision, as you indicated. I have a question. I'll quit ranting. You mentioned, and I mentioned, being nimble, building by building analysis. What would you envision that looking like?
So given, and I think we need to work collaboratively with our stakeholders to determine that, but what we've heard in the past in the fall semester is, one, both teachers and families need time if there's going to be a shift in the learning modality. So we can't wake up today, see a data set, and tomorrow say you're going to be all online, or tomorrow you're going to come back in person, which is why in the Chandler example, they've got a 48-hour notice. Whether or not that's long enough, I don't know, but I think that we have to figure out, okay, what are the parameters in terms of notice for people to be able to make proper adjustments. Secondly, I think it's important to have that time delimiting factor. It's the uncertainty. It's part of the reason why I asked the question back in December. If you went virtual, what would be the measures for coming back? Because even with the original metrics, they said, well, these are only for that initial return to learn in the fall. They didn't say that these are forever. And so having clarity around what's the exit ticket So what gets you back to virtual, and then what allows you to come back in person? I think that's really important. Could that change, to your point of being nimble? We can and will continue to learn more things. There are a lot of places that are providing in-person education, and you can continue to watch the data. To your point, it's not causal data, it's correlational at best.
Yes.
And so what we're looking for are trends and patterns that help us feel more confident about one decision over another. It's not to be able to definitively say, yes, that's the right answer. It's saying, do we see an evidence or a pattern here that when we do this, something else happens? So I asked the question, don't have the answer, but Paradise Valley has been online a lot longer. In terms of community spread, their rates actually exceeded Scottsdale's for a period of time, even though they didn't have anybody in-person learning. So that was a question for me, but that's still not a data point you can say, well, that's proof that if you're in school, you're better off than not in school. There are too many other variables at play in order to be able to make that claim. But it's the balancing act of the benefit of being in school. And if you can provide evidence that you're not seeing large numbers of cases or things that would evidence spread, because there would be the ability to show evidence of spread, and one of the things the health department cites is a study out of Mississippi where they didn't see that you had more cases from students who were in person learning, but they did find that those students who were more likely to test positive had attended weddings or other social small gatherings, and so that was part of the reason for their comments regarding in-person learning. But to your question about the structure, I think it's really important to create those broad parameters with an understanding that some of those specifics could still change as we learn more information. We don't want to lock ourselves in. I think it's a really good point. It's why I think the previous governing board didn't do that, because we knew this was a fluid situation. And at the end of the day, as a public education body, we need to center our decisions on what's in the best interest of our students, because they are the reason we exist, and we have to provide the education they need by supporting those who are working every day with them in the classroom, because without high-quality teachers, our kids don't get the education they need and deserve. And so one of the false narratives is to create a binary that it's either this or that. Yeah. My staff will talk about the importance of, and I talk about the importance of a both-and solution. It's not an either-or. It's how do we create that both-and situation where, yes, we know that we've got the situation, and how can we navigate this together to ensure that we get the best outcome?
Just to clarify, the Mississippi study that you're referring to that's cited in the guidance by the Maricopa County Department of Public Health is surveillance study. That is a non-research public health data. And I will note that the actual conclusion in the discussion of that data, it's the kids either were more likely, again, correlative data here, more likely to have contracted COVID-19 from a family gathering or a social gathering, or, and this is the part that gets left out, lack of mask compliance in school or a child care facility. Okay, so those two components were the high correlative, categories that led to the positives of the children who were in that surveillance. And there were only about 350, so that's a very small data set, one. Right. Two, all of the students who ended up in the hospital from COVID-19 were removed from that data set. You notice that? And then can I go back, though, to the original question and your comment in terms of, and where I'm going, and I think I've commented about this before, and that is decentralization of some of these decisions to authorities that could be delegated so that the buildings can be more nimble. We're here to make decisions for the district as a whole. Clearly, the buildings and the learning communities have more site-specific information than we can readily get in any kind of real-time fashion. Would you see a benefit in that type of structure, a more decentralized structure, compared to what we have now, which is why we're here.
So I think it's a qualified answer in this sense. I think the parameters and the outline need to be established by the governing board. If you spend much time looking at our communities, and if the assume for a minute under this model that if the buildings are making the decision, you've got principals in that leadership responsibility responding to the parents in a particular community. It may not be a data-driven decision. It may be the sheer force of will of the community to drive a particularly desired result. So part of the value of being able to again, find the both and is to recognize that there are differences in those communities, and we want to acknowledge those. And we even talked about how we've allowed certain pilot projects in some buildings so that we can see what works and doesn't work. But I think there still needs to be the overarching parameters established by the governing board that allows us to operate within that framework, but to also create some flexibility so that we can be nimble. So it's a both and, but I wouldn't support just pushing it out to the building level because I think it puts them on an island that's really a dangerous place to be.
Thank you.
Board Member Beckman, did you have a comment or question? It looked like you did.
Oh, not yet. I'm still writing.
Oh.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Vice President Sinowski?
Can we discuss what those would look like, those parameters, Dr. Menzel?
So you mean the parameters that we would for moving from in-person to online, or what kind of parameters?
Yes.
I mean, so for me, I am, as I've said before, I'm intrigued by the model that some of our neighbors to the south have implemented. I'd like to learn more about that and would strongly support engaging a cross-sector group to research what that might look like for the governing board and perhaps bring back a recommendation on January 19th. I think that would be something that would be of interest and could help us answer the question more specifically. I'm certainly not going to sit here and pretend that I know what the parameters should be. I think that's something that should be co-constructed in conversation with our stakeholders.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
I would like to suggest that any, I hate using the word metrics because it's really been smeared in the mud, but for not being able to think of a better term right now, some metrics that we can establish. I'm going to assume we're still talking about elementary level here. Yes?
That depends. You're free to broaden that to
Okay.
all grade levels.
I would like for us to consider this overall as a district. I know specifically elementary, I assumed we're going to start there and move up. But I would like for us to have an organization that includes not just the site administrators, but district specialists as well, experts as well, as our representative voices in our communities with our administrative association, our teachers, and our classified. Because I think all of those organizations, all of those groups need to be part of the discussion, whether we're going to discuss it as complex, high school complex oriented. Maybe that's an idea to throw out there. Or we're going to speak more specifically by, does that help? Nope.
It might be someone's computer. Oh, I apologize. Continue.
It's all right. I felt like I was in a cave. And I lost my train of thought. So let's just talk about the inclusion of, I think this is the primary point I want to make, the inclusion of truly representative voice in this structure. And a group that sits and discusses what they think is sensible, the troops on the ground, so to speak, as far as what they think is safe and what they think is best for our students. I think that's a good place for us to start, is to decide a group of individuals who would take on those tasks within the community, our teaching community and teaching and learning community.
Are there any additional comments or questions?
I have a clarifying question, so make sure I understand. So the proposal, as a, I guess, maybe not building by building, but learning community or high school complex by high school complex, establishing an ad hoc committee to advise on kind of strategies that are more specific to the community, the high school community. I'm referring to the learning community as the high school communities. Is that the question, or that's the discussion item, is what would that look like? Who would be on an ad hoc committee?
More of a suggestion of this would be a way of gathering information, because we do have families that have children at multiple levels. So if we're only going to be discussing what happens at the elementary level, we're really kind of ignoring the rest of a family dynamic if they have kids at the middle school or high school level. And it impacts that family overall. So if we say we're going to set this as a standard at the elementary level, this is the standard at the middle school level, and this at the high school level, it still impacts that entire family. So I would like to make the suggestion that it is a collective group of individuals representing the best interests of our students and in the learning communities.
Thank you. Board Member Beckman?
Yeah, so just kind of trying to wrap my arms around this conversation a little bit. I'm not going to take long, because I purposely am listening so that I can give the floor to our 3 new board members so they can ask questions and make their thoughts known to our community. Many of you have emailed me, just like Board Member Hart Wells had mentioned, and it's difficult to respond to everybody, but please know that I've read every single email. I began my week touring an elementary school, and I also spent a great deal of time on the phone with principals, teachers, and parents. I witnessed and heard of challenges, successes, optimism, and fear, all in the effort to do what we do here, which is educate kids. We've tried to look into the experts for a long time because, frankly, we are not the experts. I agree with Dr. Menzel, establishing clarity around exactly when we would go virtual, and I use that word virtual, not closed, because our teachers are doing a great job. We've never closed. We're trying to go virtual. It may provide some needed comfort to our employees. I'd like to explore this. I, too, was made aware that the East Valley started to establish this. In fact, just to kind of define it, I am told, and I don't know if this is specific, I haven't researched to get this exactly, but that Chandler, for example, the high schools would look to go virtual when the infection rate reaches 0.75%, when the middle schools reach 1%, and the elementary schools reach 1.5%. That would be the trigger. And then it would trigger that 48 hours notice, and then I think Dr. Menzel had mentioned that it's 5 days. I'm not saying that's perfect for us. I think maybe establishing a group that would derive our own points here is a good path to go down. But I think it's optimistic. I think it would help maybe give some peace and comfort to some of our employees to have something to look to.
If I may briefly try and focus things in slightly here. So right now, our elementary schools are reopened full in person. Our middle schools are scheduled to reopen on Monday, and of course, our high schools are scheduled to open on the 19th. With specific regard to that, a committee can, of course, be formed, whether the administration wants to help guide that or whether we wish to advise the leadership in our employee associations and the various non-members to kind of come together to do that. I don't know how it was done in the other districts. I just know that it was a staff-driven process, not really done by the governing board or the administration, is my understanding. That is excellent and good and well, but insofar as our current plans, is there a desire to amend the current plans in any capacity? And I believe the hope was we would start with elementary school first, at this time, given what we know and/or don't know, whether there is any change desired to the elementary schools. Vice President Sinowski.
I'm fine with, personally, with continuing with elementary in-person instruction as long as we are not seeing alarming or increases in transmission. Board Member Hart Wells talked about transmissibility, and I feel like that is something we can focus on trying to have impact on. I think our class size, and I know there are parents that are moving back into the classroom after a semester of virtual learning. A concern for me is having a student show up that hasn't been there, and it may not just have been Monday, but it may be next Monday. And as those numbers keep ticking, at what point are we going to say that's enough? Either the family, because we don't have the staff to staff another classroom, the family has to wait until that can happen, or maybe we make the recommendation of that family then going to a different school that has maybe lower class sizes in our district. I also think that our notification process, as far as tracking and tracing the transmissibility, the cases in place, I think we can strengthen that up. And I do believe that the staff should be the first ones to be informed as soon as it's known that a student, so then the staff members can make the appropriate actions within the learning environment, as well as the district's practice of notifying other students. I think it's also important to discuss the way we have our elementary instruction set up, where we have specialists and physical education and art and music, where we have these specialists that actually do see all the students. So they're more in the category of middle school and high school when it comes to contacts throughout a day. I understand the importance of having cohorts of kids together, and I think that's a great way to trace, but it's not practical when we have to actually have that tracing when we have a specialist that sees all of the students on a regular basis. So I think we really need to be looking at the perspective of the entire instructional gamut, not just a classroom. So again, class size, I would like for us to be discussing what that limitation is. I know there are bigger issues when it comes to HR and staffing potential and ability. I mean, we're living in an era where we're doing emergency sub-certifications just to get, at times, warm bodies of supervision in. The push-in is also, I think, something that we need to consider being more flexible with in the future as well, because I think if it's going to work to keep a top quality staff member in our schools, then let's do that. So class size, sharpening up the notification process, and I think that's it. Yep. Yep.
Vice President Sinowski, would you clarify for continuing elementary school in-person instruction, subject to alarming increase in transmission, what are you proposing, a temporary threshold until a committee comes to us? Or are you asking that we continue with elementary school in-person, doing a school-by-school review as we have been doing so far?
I think the school-by-school review makes sense in a district our size. So I'd like to suggest that, but I think we can learn from our, we don't need to reinvent any wheels here. We can learn from our neighbors and establish a number. Yeah, I believe it was 0.75 for elementary.
1.5.
1.5, yes, I'm sorry, 0.75 was high school.
Yes.
So 1.5 for elementary. So let me just ask, what would the schools that have, all three schools that have 3 new cases, what % does that put those schools at?
Well, so I have to look and see what the school is, but we don't have a school with less than 350 kids, and so if you had 3 out of 350, plus you're going to add the staff, you're significantly under that threshold.
Okay.
Yes, I have done, in relation to that question, I did do a quick review comparing Chandler's metrics to our week-by-week data, if I may use that word in relation to this discussion. It would be pretty rare for a school to ever hit the 1.5% threshold. I will say that ignoring the threshold, if the ADHS or MCDPH, I apologize, in reviewing our cases sees a big increase, if all of a sudden we have 10 or 15, I think the recommendation would be to close down the classroom or the school.
Well, and I don't even think it'd have to be as high as 10 or 15.
No.
Yeah.
So when you look at, if you've got a case in a class here, oftentimes they're siblings too. I mean, so you can connect the dots, which helps with it. But if you have unconnected dots, and I've got 4 or 5 in a classroom, that elevates the concern. So I think it's a both and, again, approach, that the percent thresholds are designed to look at building level return to virtual learning. That doesn't mean you don't look at the other evidence that's presented in terms of whether or not there's something else that warrants moving in that direction. It's one of the reasons why having the open dialogue with Maricopa County Department of Public Health is helpful, because that way we can say contextually, because they always want to know the specifics. I mean, we're reporting all these cases, and then if there's something that becomes that worrisome spread, we can take the appropriate measure. So we wouldn't want to box ourselves in by saying, well, no, you're still below that percent threshold, if there's something else that's really happening that we need to get ahead of. So I think it's being open to looking at the specific data, but also recognizing that those are relevant parameters to say, if it's above that, that's probably a good indication of some concern that the level within the school is so high that the likelihood of potential spread. And I appreciate your reminder on the mask wearing, because Dr. Sonnenschein, when I went back to my notes, that was another one of the pieces is we have to be very religious about the mask wearing. This is for staff and students. It's all of us together properly wearing our mask reduces the potential for spread. And that's something that a drum we can't beat often enough, even though I think I say it all the time. I need to say it more, and I appreciate your reminder on that, because it's critical to being able to keep schools open.
Board Member Hart Wells.
I have 2, I guess, questions, and insofar as have they been considered already internally in the administration? And hopefully, maybe they could prop up or bolster some of the effectiveness of the tracing, the transmissibility data, and the susceptibility. And the one is in tracing. So I mentioned, and we know the virus is harbored in the mucosal tissue that is on orifices, though some schools, and they're usually universities, have tested the wastewater. So fecal contamination is one way that virus is shed, and in lieu of relying on voluntary compliance with testing in the community by families, which may or may not be a barrier, and with good reason, like I mentioned before, you might not just not know. One way to know is to test the wastewater in the buildings. There is some precedent. University of Arizona is doing this. A number of the colleges that are keeping open are doing this in conjunction with other strategies, but just as one possibility to help in a non-invasive way bolster the accuracy of that data. And then the second thing I'd like to raise, and that is consideration that in quarantining, and I know there is an art and a science to what you've developed in how to identify who's a close contact in a room, in a classroom, But two comments on that. The public health, or the CDC, or I guess it's the public health, I'm not sure it's the CDC or I'm not recalling, but an outbreak is defined as two persons who are linked. They have, transmitted to one of the other. In a classroom, would that be helpful guidance to identify what would be a benchmark for a building or a classroom per se? And I don't know what the answer is. I'm just putting it out there because it's public health guidance. And then the second is when a student is exposed to another student in an in-person learning setting, and I will acknowledge Board Member Beckman, I used the word close the school, and she was absolutely right. It should be using virtual learning and not closing the school. Is if a student is exposed and they are notified they need to quarantine, it'd be nice if that letter, of course, came as quickly as possible. But if that student who is exposed has siblings in the household, the siblings in the household can go to school, or at least that's what was happening in the fall. I'm not sure where that practice originated, but it does, in my opinion, doesn't reinforce the importance of quarantining. That's really the whole point of contact tracing, is to quarantine aggressively. So I just put that on the table for a discussion item because it would seem appropriate that if I'm in a room for an hour with someone and I have to quarantine, that the person I live with for 12 hours should probably also be considered exposed. Mm-hmm. Maybe not primary, but from index patient, but a secondary exposure. So that's my my question and comment in general.
Dr. Menzel.
So in terms of the question, there have been some discussions about whether or not to do wastewater testing, and I did explore that with Maricopa County Department of Public Health, and also would acknowledge that primarily universities have been using it related to residence halls. And so when you get into a school facility where it's non-specific, you wouldn't be able to tie it to a classroom, for example. So you might be able to detect some spread in a building. The question is, are you going to be able to detect enough to do something other than a more dramatic action than might be required? Another solution that some places are implementing is pooled testing. So you take 5 or 10 people, use a saliva test. If that comes back negative, then that group is considered to be good. So in an environment like ours with the lack of specificity in the wastewater, the pool testing seemed to be one that might be more specific and help avoid a more extreme response than would be perhaps required. So we have looked at some of that. Part of all of these with respect to testing, and the governing board members who've been here since July know we've been trying to have conversations about how do we get testing regularly available at a price point that the district can afford, because that gives us actionable data. And so we're continuing to look at that. We've got an emerging company here in Scottsdale with 2 former SUSD graduates that are putting testing options together. Now, we have to figure out what the price point is and how we can do this, but I think that there'll continue to be opportunities to be able to do some of that. But yes, we have looked at it.
Board Member Beckman.
Dr. Menzel, first I want to thank you. You're answering a lot of questions, and it's not easy. You're transitioning from the old board with all their questions and concerns to the new board, so I really appreciate you taking that on and having very thoughtful, researched answers for us. But having said that, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, I'm just circling back to this action item because we're reviewing the phased-in return to learning plan in person. Can you just summarize what your recommendation is, not personally, but given your discussions with the county and others, what you are recommending to the board, knowing that it is ultimately our decision, that we move forward with?
Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. First, I'll restate what the plan is that is in place at the present time. So elementary, pre-K, and special education self-contained are back in person at the present time. The plan as approved back in December is that middle school would return on January 11th, and that our high school students would return on January 19th, because the 18th is a holiday. The K-8s were given some flexibility in terms of when they returned, and so a couple of them are back full in session this week. Some are planning on coming back next week. Given my conversation with Dr. Sonnenschein, I think there are a couple of options on a go-forward basis. So one, I don't recommend that we have elementary go back virtual. Those students are back in session. We've got data that's indicating right now we don't have large numbers of cases, much like we saw in the fall. Elementary seemed to maintain that level. So I would not make a modification there at this time, but I would, to Board Member Sanowski's point, I think the careful monitoring, staying on top of that, doing the monitoring the class size and tracking that as well to make sure we don't have some of those pinch points that could be problematic. I support that, but I wouldn't reverse what we've done there. I think, based on what Dr. Sonnenschein said, the board could continue with the plan as proposed, or the board could make the move from middle school from the 11th to the 19th. That gives you the full 2 weeks of the cycling. It's only one more week of online learning for the middle school students, but it provides that buffer. If you remember, the original thought when we discussed this back in December was the phase-in like we did in the fall, which would have been K2 first, then 3-5, and then 6-8 and high school would have all been on the 19th. That was the first discussion. We ended up with full elementary first, then middle school, and that's in part, I think, because of what Dr. Sonnenschein and the Health Department had recommended, prioritizing elementary and middle. But I think you have two viable options here if you keep elementary where it is, and that is either retain the phase-in plan as approved or have middle school move back to the 19th and then spend the time to build in those other parameters so that we have clearer guidance that help alleviate some of the angst that people feel with that uncertainty.
Thank you, Dr. Menzel.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments in relation to the elementary schools? Board Member Lindsay?
So just to clarify, the careful monitoring going forward would be you consulting with Dr. Sonnenschein, the Department of Health, still?
Well, it's that, and so we've hired a COVID specialist to stay on top of the data, to make the phone calls, and Whitney's been doing an amazing job in keeping track of that and providing regular updates so that we kind of can track. We know when we get the positive diagnosis. We know people who are symptomatic that are waiting for a positive diagnosis. We know what expected return dates are. Our nurses are doing a phenomenal job of tracking. I mean, I can't say enough positive about all the work that people are doing to identify, to track the students who are quarantined voluntarily as a result of a close contact or as a result of exposure outside of school. So we've got a lot of different data points. So the close monitoring is taking all of that into consideration and the conversation with the health department in order to inform our next steps.
And then we would look at forming a committee to possibly do the metrics for the schools. Right?
Yes, that could be our direction to the board. Are we permitted to make a direction to the superintendent on this? We are permitted to direct the superintendent.
Because I will say, Board Member Beckman was correct on her numbers that she shared, but there is variation with other districts, like Gilbert, for example. Their numbers are a little bit different than Chandler, so it would be good to have the committee, review all of that and come up with our own numbers.
As our council indicated, the best process for tonight, if we're going to make any action items, is to have one single action item. So I would ask, just for my sake and being able to draft and write it out, is there any portion of an action item tonight that somebody would like to make in relation to elementary schools, or do we believe at this time we should leave the plans as is? Vice President Stanowski.
I'd like for us to have a real brief conversation on class sizes, because when we talk about transmissibility, I think that is a key factor. You can only fit so many, but we kind of have said, well, we can't really keep that 6 foot expected distance But we can also say we can limit the number of little warm bodies in an elementary classroom. So I would like for us to have that discussion of what is reasonable for us to expect a maximum number of students at any time would be in an elementary classroom.
Dr. Menzel or Dr. Momin, are either of you able to speak to the largest in-person class sizes we have currently at the elementary school level?
So we have the numbers, and part of what is challenging with this is that you have the actual numbers per class, you have the averages, which we've shared before, and then you may have one or two outliers, and then there are oftentimes explanations or reasons for those. So it depends on which grade level you're looking at. As a district, the established ratios, and just so that everybody's clear on what those are, in kindergarten, it's 24. In first grade, it's 26. In second grade, it's 27. In third grade, it's 28. And in fourth and fifth grade, it's 29. So those are the ratios that we have as a district for those class sizes. Now, as I understand it, and Dr. Bowman, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the average class size across our elementaries is 21 or 22 students per class, but that's the average. And so depending on which building you're in and what grade level you're in, that number will vary. So we have a couple of classes in the upper elementary grades that are higher in level, right? So we've got two at Copper Ridge at 29 in third grade. And there were conversations with the principal about making a change, and for some reason, they said, this is working and let's not change it. So there are other times where we've actually brought in another teacher and distributed the class sizes. The challenge with the moving target, to your point, of when you add one, is if you bring in another teacher and then you try to redistribute, that's disruptive for both the students, the teacher, the families, and who gets redistributed versus who gets to stay with the other teacher. But I think it's fair to say, looking at what can we do to mitigate any of those increases, one of the questions that's come up is open enrollment. Are we continuing to take out-of-district students that could be pinching these numbers? It's great to grow our student enrollment in a non-COVID time, because that's part of the economic engine that drives the district. Right. But I don't want to take an open enrollment student if it's going to put us over what's a defensible limit in a classroom. Whereas if I've got some classrooms, I've got a fourth grade classroom in one of our buildings with 13. There's room in a class of 13, right? So our smallest brick and mortar classroom has 8. So we can go from 8 to 29, and then depending on the building and where you're at, some of our buildings are really they're not lying when they say they're full. There's 93 or 94% of the students chose to come back in person. That's not necessarily average daily attendance, but that's kids on the roster that you have to watch. So it's a nuanced answer to the question. I think it's really important. How we solve the problem is one that I think takes more time than we could solve tonight.
I accept that. Can we talk about defining that defensible limit?
I think that
Can you work
I can work.
cabinet and the principals in defining what that defensible limit is?
I think that there are some work that we can do there, both around, and we did some of this. So we created, in the fall semester, we looked at what's the physical limitation, because in some buildings, Tavon, you've got larger classrooms, so you can really, and I visited, so I saw the space in Tavon, but then you go to some of our other buildings, so you're at Echo Canyon or some other buildings, and the classrooms are smaller. So I think even, to have one uniform standard for the district doesn't take into account what your physical space limitation might be. So yes, we can do more work there and strategize how do we address the churn. So one of the notes I made during your conversation is this churn and return piece. And that is a big challenge for us. At the end of the day, most of our parents want to be in person. The truth is, most of our teachers want to be in person. Everybody just wants to do it safely. And so that's kind of the balancing act. And I think our commitment administratively is to on an ongoing basis, try to find ways to ensure that we're implementing all the mitigation strategies and operating in a way that helps ensure that our teachers and students are safe when they come to in-person learning.
Are there any other comments in relation to the current elementary school plans? We can move then to discussing middle school, high school, or both together. It might make sense to discuss both together for making this a little more efficient and straightforward, since a lot of these same rules apply to all grades. And Dr. Menzel put forward the idea that we could delay middle school by, for example, another week, so that it would open on the 19th along with high schools. So that is one option, and I will open the floor to discussion. Board Member Lindsay.
You know, we've heard from a lot of teachers and parents, you know, everybody's concerned. If we were to push middle school back a week, I would question how quickly could we form this committee to develop these metrics? Because I think the metrics would go a long way to making staff feel better, that there were actual metrics that we were going to follow per site. So then we don't get to the 19th and then we're meeting and maybe we push it back again. Because I would like to give these families, everybody some finality to this. So I just question, what's a reasonable timeline to create the committee to start working on these metrics?
Well, we can create the committee quickly. Between tonight's meeting and the beginning of next week. And quite frankly, because I think this is an issue of importance to all the stakeholders we talked about having represented in the conversation, we'll make the time to be able to have the conversation, do the investigation, to gather, you know, what the others are doing, what the rationale was, and have that conversation. I believe that we could bring the recommendation forward to the governing board for approval on the 19th, because that's our next meeting. So there's enough time between today, the 7th, and the 19th to have several committee meetings, do our due diligence, and bring back a recommendation.
So then how would that work with middle and high school? If they were going to start on the 19th, would we maybe want to delay it by a day or two so we could have that board meeting and a conversation? Or do we just say they're going to start on the 19th, we're going to have the board meeting and approve the metrics?
So I think there are a couple of ways to think about that, right? Part of the challenge in this environment is until you have students back, how do you have the numbers to be able to determine if you're at that threshold or not? So from that perspective, I don't know that a delay of a day or two matters. I think knowing what the number is, because we then on a weekly basis, we're tracking the case counts, staff and students, and working then to provide that update on a weekly basis. So I don't think there's a problem with starting on the same day that it's approved. I just think it's important to have a good recommendation for the governing board to consider.
Are there any other questions or comments? Board Member Hart Wells.
A comment on my rubrics there: susceptibility, severe mortality, morbidity, negative societal impact, and transmissibility. The physiological difference in terms of susceptibility, where the young under age of 12, pre-adolescent, might be low, that is not observed today in the adolescent or older learners. So I believe this is a slightly different paradigm that we need to look at with respect to the middle school and high school. It is not that in-person learning isn't the best for them. That is not my origin of the comment. The origin of the comment is in the rubric that I shared with you, and in the ethical and procedural principles that I shared with you. So my chart looks different for 6 through 8, 9 through 12, and educational workers. They all look kind of the same with respect to all 4 of those categories. So I would ask that we reconsider the start date of the middle school on Monday and push it to the 19th and sync up with the high school. And this is a discussion. I didn't come into this discussion with a preconceived agenda at all. I'm just putting it out there.
Are there any additional comments or questions? Vice President Sanowski?
Comment? I concur with Board Member Hart Wells. I think it is prudent to revisit data since we seem to always be functioning in lag time. And since what we know is this particular age group we're discussing, middle school and high school, have the greater transmissibility rates, I think we should delay the start of middle school until the 19th of January.
Board Member Beckman, do you have any comments or questions?
No. Now, just a quick question regarding the agenda item. It said, for example, discussion of hybrid in-person teacher-led instruction, virtual, et cetera. So we are just discussing the absolute dates of returning, et cetera, not the actual learning plans tonight, are we?
I believe it is the phased-in return to learning in person and potential modifications to that plan. That is correct.
Okay. That was just my question. No comment.
Board Member Lindsay?
And with pushing middle school back, I don't know if that has to be added, but the formation of the committee, so there could be a recommendation at the 19th board meeting with the metrics.
Is there any other comments or questions? Sorry, Board Member Beckman.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I need someone to answer this for me then, including potential changes to any learning format. So, Dr. Menzel, again, I guess I just don't have clarity. At some point, I do have some questions about the asynchronous learning again, but I don't think this is on the agenda item. But this kind of gives me pause if that's supposed to fall under here, or should I just wait for another meeting to bring that up?
So I think there are 2 things. We did craft the agenda item so that we had maximum latitude to make decisions. One of the things that could be considered but is not being recommended is you could go to a full 6-period day and ignore the fact that we've created this modified schedule at the middle school and high school so that we don't have the problem with lunch, for example. We're not tonight recommending that we tackle that. I do think that we should consistently be reviewing our model and determining what makes the most sense in order to meet the educational needs of our students. And so I don't know that tonight's the night to do that. I think really there's some urgency around the phased in. But duly noted that on the 19th, as we're looking at how this is rolled out and where we're going from here, that's a legitimate topic of conversation.
And I would appreciate that. I know we don't have any future agenda items discussion tonight since this was a special meeting, but because it was kind of wrapped in to this, I'm satisfied with your response, but I would like to see a discussion around that model. Just some questions about it since we will, have absorbed it for a while in EDL, maybe at the next meeting. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? Board Member Hart Wells?
So there are the K through 8, and I believe in the current return to learn plan, there were a few of the K through 8 that are in person now. Could you just clarify if those K through 8 buildings that are in person now are offering in-person learning now? are offering up through K through 8.
So
Thank you.
Cheyenne and Echo Canyon, Dr. Sackos or Dr. Hagigat, correct me if I'm wrong, are currently K-8 with all of the students returning. My understanding is that next week, the other two K-8s were planning on returning their 6-8 students. And because, I mean, those buildings are just uniquely situated between the boundary of elementary and middle school, we did provide them with that option, either to start on January 4th or to come back on the 11th with their middle school age students. Yes, Dr. Hagigat.
Yes, and Copper Ridge has their K-8 with 6-8 being half-days at this time, moving into full days next week. Just wanted to clarify that. You're welcome.
Vice President Sinowski.
So that means that Copper Ridge will have lunch for their middle school students, their 6-8 students?
I think part of the mitigation strategies you can put in place when you look at the number of middle school students in Copper Ridge and compare that with Tonalea, for example, Tonalea is much closer in terms of numbers to a Mojave or Cocopah than Copper Ridge or Echo Canyon, which are really small campuses. So you have the ability to implement mitigation strategies in those smaller campuses that are harder to do when you have a lot more middle school students. And I think that's why they were granted more flexibility.
So they feel that they can safely provide lunchtime for the students? Okay.
Board Member Lindsay.
So since this says the modifications of the plan, currently we have elementary doing their early release on Wednesdays. And I don't know if this can be discussed, but with the signups for the vaccination, one of those days is a Friday that's available. I didn't know if it's something that we could discuss on that particular week, moving the early release on Wednesday to Friday, so staff could take advantage of that time on Friday to go get vaccinated if they so wish.
So we're working, I appreciate the question. We're working to find one of multiple strategies to ensure that our staff can sign up for any available slot on any one of those 3 days. So that if it's during the workday on a Friday, what we know from our nurses who have gone through it is that it's a 20 to 30 minute experience in the car from start to finish. And you got to allow some travel time. So with advance notice of when our staff have found their slots, we have other people who can step in and cover a classroom. We want to prioritize those who are doing the in-person teaching so that we can make sure that they get vaccinated and in that list. And then if you're online, it's possible to, for an hour, do some asynchronous, this is the work that we need you to do, and then we'll be back to engage at a later time. So I think we've got some options, but we absolutely want our staff to be able to take advantage of any one of those 3 days. I mean, weekends are more convenient, but we've talked as a leadership team about how we're going to be able to fill for those who need to go, because getting vaccinated is the top priority there on those days.
Are there any other questions or comments? So the motion that would be proposed, as I have it, is to A, reopen middle schools for in-person learning on January 19th, 2021, and B, direct our superintendent to form a committee of our administrative, certified, and classified staff in consultation with our employee associations, develop site-based metrics for returning to virtual learning, and present those metrics to the governing board on January 19th, 2021 for its review and approval. Do I have any comments to those parts? Vice President Sinowski.
Not just to return to virtual, but then also to come back to,
Return to in-person.
return to in-person,
Right.
yes.
Transitioning to virtual learning and returning back to in-person learning. Are there any other additional amendments, or would you all like me to reread it? I will comment now very briefly. I agree with the move of pushing back the start of middle school to January 19th. I believe, as has been explained very well by Board Member Hart Wells, Vice President Sanowski, Board Member Lindsay, Board Member Beckman, and our administration, and Dr. Menzel, this is a very complex situation. The data is not perfect. There are many flaws to it. There are many flaws in relying only on that data. We acknowledge that. We've acknowledged that for pretty much this entire year, really. And we don't have much necessarily to work with or ways to fix it ourselves. It's just not in our authority. But I do think it's quite clear that the rate of spread in the state of Arizona and in our community specifically is very high. I would recommend to our community that they not just look at our state metrics, but they look at the CDC guidelines, which does place us in the very high risk to highest risk category for in-person learning. Those have been the CDC guidelines for a number of months now, so that isn't new. It's just that we were specifically and have been specifically focusing on the ADHS and Maricopa County Department of Health metrics because those are the individuals with whom we work on a day-to-day basis. And I very much appreciate Dr. Sonnenscheins and all of the directors of our hospitals working with Dr. Menzel and the work he has done to build those relationships. Our community might not know this or appreciate this, but not every district in this state and not every school in this state has those relationships. There are many schools and districts and many other organizations, restaurants and bars, that don't get the level of attention that we receive. We are very lucky to have it. And so I would just like to thank all the work and their time for that and our administration's time for putting that together and really diving into the details there. I don't think, and I think it seems to be the board's view as well, that changing elementary school at this time is the best decision. I think that really needs to be carefully reviewed on a site-by-site basis. I don't know if anyone has had the opportunity to visit our elementary schools. I know Board Member Lindsay has and Board Member Beckman has. But the students are resilient. The staff members are resilient. The staff members, I should just say for all of our teachers, in person, online, are working so hard to provide a great education to our students. And I really appreciate and thank them for that work as well. I know not every decision we make they support, they're not happy with everything, but we really are trying to do our best here and achieve some very good and safe results for our staff and our students. With that said.
President
yes.
Greenberg, if I could.
Yes.
When you asked me whether it was permissible to give direction to the superintendent, I didn't realize you were going to make it part of the motion.
Could we just make it a direction?
I think you can do either. It might be preferable, given the short amount of time, to make it just separate direction, because if the board appoints, then it becomes an advisory committee that has to follow open meeting law and posting, which can just take extra time.
Excellent point. Thank you very much. So we will not include that in our motion, and we will separately direct you to do that. I believe you heard that.
I have been so directed.
Okay. The chair moves to reopen middle schools for in-person learning on January 19th, 2021. Do I have a second? Vice President Sanowski seconds. Is there any debate? If there is no debate, all those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, aye. All those opposed vote no. The motion carries 5-0. This concludes the board's agenda. The chair moves to adjourn this January 7th, 2021 special meeting of the Scottsdale Unified No. 48 Governing Board at 8:14 p.m. Is there a second to the motion? Board Member Hart Wells seconds. It is moved and seconded that the board adjourn this January 7th, 2021 special meeting of the Scottsdale Unified No. 48 Governing Board. Is there any debate? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries 5-0. The meeting is adjourned.